I'm Elizabeth Warren. Thank you for coming today. I just want to say a few words and then I'm happy to take your questions. Earlier today, my friend and my former colleague, Rich Cordray, announced that he's going to resign as the director of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau by the end of this month. Rich has dedicated much of his life to protecting consumers and to holding big companies accountable. I called him 7 years ago this week to ask him to help me set up this brand new agency that we were building. And in the years since, he has forced the biggest financial institutions in this country to return more than $12 billion directly to consumers they cheated. That's government that works for the people. Rich has a record he should be proud of. I am proud of him, and I have nothing but gratitude for his service. From the day that the agency opened its doors, the CFPB has been targeted by Republicans and their Wall Street bank allies. They attacked the agency at every turn and tried to stop it from helping consumers. They tried to smear Rich Cordray and the good people at the agency who were just trying to make things better for working families. And they are still champing at the bit to do exactly that. We need to make sure that the next leader of the CFPB builds on the agency's good work rather than reversing it. This is a big test for Donald Trump. He said on the campaign trail that he would stand up to Wall Street and defend forgotten Americans. That is literally the job of the CFPB, to stand up to Wall Street. If the president appoints another industry hack or bought and paid for politician to lead the agency, it is just the latest sign that he wants to run this government to help his rich buddies. The CFPB has done great work, but there are still serious problems facing consumers. Hidden fees, misleading disclosures, harassing calls, fake accounts. The CFPB needs a leader with a demonstrated track record of protecting consumers and holding big financial firms accountable when they cheat people. Anything less is a slap in the face to working people. And with that, I'm glad to take your questions. Yes, sir.
Do you think that the problem with, or the perception on the right with the CFPB is because it came in at the time when we were under the fiscal crisis, it was closely associated with the Obama administration, and they were fighting against everything that he was for at that point. They fought against the stimulus at the time and so on, and that even if the agency does some good things, that those on the right have failed to ever get past that because they associate it with that time in this big government, quote unquote, of the Obama period.
Yeah, that is certainly would fit the facts, but I see it differently. I think the problem is that the Wall Street banks really don't like the CFPB, and they have about 12 billion reasons not to like it. It costs them money. It makes it harder for them to build profit models around cheating people. Look at Wells Fargo. Look at what Wells Fargo was doing. They built an entire multi-year business plan around opening fake accounts and then pumping up their stock price based on the fact that they were opening all of these new accounts. It's the CFPB that actually investigates and holds them accountable. And that's a darn good reason for giant financial institutions not to like them. So, and I say that because I really want to press on this point. They spend a lot of money here in Washington. They hire a lot of lobbyists. They hire a lot of lawyers. They put money into think tanks. They have bought and paid for experts just to keep up the drumbeat that the CFPB is creating a problem. And at its heart, the problem that the CFPB is creating is it helps level the playing field between giant Wall Street banks and the American people.
And that's why I asked that question about the
Fair enough.
Of the period, because the economy and people were concerned
Right.
about what banks have been doing that led to the financial collapse.
Right. And what I'm saying is the part where I get more of the focus is that it's the financial banks getting what they want from their Republican friends in Congress. Sure.
Rich is obviously expected to go back to Ohio to run for governor. His likely Democratic opponents in the gubernatorial primary are criticizing him for handing over the agency to Donald Trump and not staying out until his term expired in July. Would you have preferred him to stay until July, and do you think that's a fair criticism?
Now, when I called Rich 7 years ago this week, it was to ask him to come temporarily to help set up the agency. I told him that we had under a year to get it done, and would he come and set up the enforcement division, because I knew he would be a great partner in doing that. He has stayed for 7 years and devoted his life to making this agency work on behalf of the American people. I feel nothing but gratitude to Rich.
Should Democrats get behind making the CFPB a bipartisan commission, or can you explain why it's worth dealing with the Republican director for the next several years?
So the commission question is fundamentally about whether the agency will work or just slow down. Look at the SEC. There's a 5-person commission at the SEC. And what happened in the many years to the run-up of the financial crisis? They knew what was going on. The evidence was clear. It was everywhere. And they were paralyzed. They could not move forward. And the consequence was that the risk kept building, that the investments were further and further out of line, and ultimately they stood on the sidelines as the large financial institutions crashed this economy. And tens of millions of people paid the price for that. They lost their homes, they lost their savings, they lost their jobs. There are neighborhoods in America that have not yet recovered from the 2008 crash and may not recover for another generation. That's the kind of cost that's imposed. In the area of financial services, a regulator needs to be nimble. It doesn't take long to come out with a new product, to figure out one more way to deceive people, to trick people on a mortgage. And the first thing you know, they've sold 1 million of those mortgages, and then it's 5 million of those mortgages, and then it's 50 million of those mortgages, and then the entire economy has been put at risk. I believe that we need a regulator on the consumer side who is nimble and able to respond to the crises the crises before they bring down the American economy and families all across this country.
So you don't support a commission?
I do not. Sorry, I guess I should have made that point even clearer up front. Yes, I do not support a commission. Sure.
Do you think it's better to leave the director position unfilled than to appoint someone like a Pruitt who's at EPA and like our new HHS nominee?
Look, I don't want to make this about politics. What I want to see here is a director who has a proven track record with the ability to stand up to Wall Street and a willingness to fight on behalf of the American people. We need an agency that can function, and that means a leader who understands the fundamental mission of this agency and is willing to step in and make that happen. Yes, ma'am.
Rep. Spears said that she has not spoken.
Can I just see if there's anyone else on CFPB, and then I promise I'll come back, okay? On Rich or the CFPB? Anybody else? Looks like, yes.
One more question. I mean,
Sure.
are you just assuming now that the work he has done over the last several years is going to be sort of washed away? I mean, is there anything Democrats can do to sort of push
Well,
back?
look, right off the top, do understand how much the world has changed since that little agency has been up and running. That $12 billion that the big financial institutions had to return to the people they cheated, they're not getting it back again. That part stays where it is. The 1 million complaints that the agency has handled and helped people get some relief, that's not going backwards. But more to the point, that whole industry has started to shift. Consumers now see that there's an alternative for them. You know, what was the answer 6 or 7 years ago? If your bank cheated you out of $50, where did you go? The answer is nowhere, right? today you can file a complaint with the CFPB. And many times those complaints are resolved because the CFPB comes in now behind the consumer and gets some resolution. And it becomes a matter of public record. So now it's possible for every one of you to go to the CFPB website and just check. See how JP Morgan Chase is doing with its consumer credit cards. See how Wells Fargo is doing with its home mortgages. There's actually a market discipline that is beginning to emerge because of the procedures that have been set up by the CFPB. I think that work is going to continue. They have a strong enforcement agency, a group of people who are dedicated to keeping an eye on these giant financial institutions and making sure that these big financial institutions follow the law. Don't build their profit models around cheating people. I don't think that's going to change. It's an agency that has a mission that goes all the way down. It's not something that's glued on at the top. The people who come to the CFPB come there because they believe that consumers should have a chance to build a little economic security without getting cheated by a handful of giants. And I think much of that work will continue. Anybody else on CFPB? Good, now it's yours.
Rep. Spears says she has not spoken with any of the two current members who have been accused of sexual harassment. Does it not worry you that we don't know their names? Do you think that it's wrong that we don't know who they are, and how can they be held accountable?
So it's my understanding that Representative Spears has signed a non-disclosure to get the information that she has. And so she's limited in what she can say. In general, I believe in transparency. The world is changing very quickly. The first women who spoke up were incredibly brave to do so. And they inspired another wave of women, who inspired another wave of women, who inspired another wave of women. And now we're reaching a critical mass of women and some young men who say, we're not going to be preyed upon anymore by more powerful men. We will speak up. And that's how we're going to make change. We're going to do it right out in the open.
Are you worried that they may still be behaving inappropriately in Congress?
I think when we get this, this is why I drive toward out in the open. I think that in this area, transparency is what gives us the best opportunity for change. Good. We have time for one more? Did you say one more? Anybody else have one? Anybody?
I guess since you mentioned this in respect to the successor at the CFPB, and you also mentioned it before the vote on the rule that was just overturned, and
The forced arbitration rule.
the forced arbitration
Sure.
rule.
Mm-hmm.
The extent to which you think that this is an issue that could be campaigned on, maybe by Democrats, particularly going the disconnect between President Trump's campaign message and what's going on at the agencies, and with nominating Scott Garrett to lead the Export-Import Bank and other places where there's an obvious disconnect there.
Mm-hmm. So, look, for me, this is less about politics and more about what happens to American families. The consumer agency, in a very short time, has given a voice to the American people and has helped level the playing field in ways that we haven't seen ever before. Donald Trump said all during his campaign he wanted to be there for the people. He would be there for the little guy. He would be there for the forgotten man. Well, this is your test, Donald Trump. If that's the case, this is your chance to put someone in charge of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau who's on the side of the consumer. That's the only job of this agency. This agency is there to level the playing field between giant financial institutions that have incredible resources, have incredible power here in Washington. This is the one chance for consumers to have somebody whose only job is to look out for them, to make sure they didn't get ripped off. And Donald Trump can put someone in this job who will continue in that tradition, who will follow the law that was put in place when the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau was built. But he's the one who's got to step up. I can't think of a clearer example of where the president will make a choice. He's either on the side of the Wall Street banks or he's on the side of the American families. Good. We'll do one more, if that's okay, Lacey. Yeah.
Is your concern more that you talked about, a banker or a bought and paid for politician being appointed? Is your concern more that the enforcement agenda would slow down, or that the rulemaking agenda or rules that were finalized under Director Cordray would be rolled back under somebody?
It's all of it. Because the CFPB works using several tools. One is enforcement, another is rulemaking, but it's also data gathering. If you ever get a chance, you should go over and see some of the work they're doing. They do hotspot reporting, for example. So as those complaints come in, they map them. What kinds of products are people starting to complain about? Is it happening in a particular geographic region? Is it a particular financial institution that's suddenly jumping out? And that helps inform the agency's response. Who do they need to go talk to? What other information do they need to gather? It's fundamentally beginning to make a market work where none had worked before. The days when you could count on the fact that everybody fully understood every consumer product because they were all pretty simple, right? You borrowed money over a period of time at a fixed interest rate that was right there on a one-page agreement. Those days have been gone now for decades. The financial products have become increasingly complex, and that complexity was not added to help consumers. That complexity was added to help build business models that would eke more dollars out of consumers' pockets and make it into the pockets of the big banks. And what the consumer agency has done is brought some market discipline back to this. So that's what I was talking about the complaint hotline. One of the things that's so remarkable about it is partly some people get $50 back. That's a great thing, right? Partly it alerts the enforcement division about where a problem may be starting to grow up. But partly it's about making markets work again because there's information now in the market. So there are CEOs of large financial institutions who end up at the bottom of the list in terms of customers were satisfied with their interactions with their bank in these the complaint database, and who decide they don't want to be there. They want to be a company that builds a reputation for working better with its customers. In the past, a company that wanted to do that had no way to advertise that other than to buy advertising. And you could buy advertising whether you were actually a good bank or a bad bank. But now, when you've got this robust and growing complaint database, it is now possible to begin to get market discipline back in to the system. So a bank like Chase, and I'm just using it as an example, can say, we're doing really badly. Consumers are telling us they're very unhappy with our credit cards. What do we need to change to become the credit card company that instead of being the most complained about, we become the least complained about. We have the best ratings in the CFPB database. And that's so important because now, instead of just the power of enforcement or the power of being forced to return the $50 you cheated somebody out of, it becomes the power of the market that banks start to worry they're going to lose customers if they don't do this the right way. They're going to lose it to customers that do a better job with their consumers. And when that happens, markets are working, the CFPB is doing its job. And so that's why it's a long answer, and I apologize for that, and probably not at all quotable because of how long it is. But the point is, the pieces are related to each other, and they all ultimately drive toward that question of how to get this market working in a world of mass transactions, highly concentrated power with a handful of large financial institutions, and hundreds of millions of dispersed customers. The CFPB is the answer. That's why I love it. Good. Everybody good? All right. Thank you. Oh, do we have one more? Sure. You bet.
Semi-related. I mean, earlier this week, some of the Democrats on the banking committee came out with an agreement with Chairman Crapo to roll back some Dodd-Frank rules. And you put out a statement saying this would be bad for consumers. Can you explain why it would be, like how consumers would be hurt by this?
Well, so the principal feature of this bill is to reduce the regulations on banks that have between $50 billion and $250 billion in assets. Those are banks that just a few years ago were receiving TARP bailout money, because without that money, the fear was the entire economy would be unable to recover. So, look, I just did my 16th town hall so far this year in Greenfield, Massachusetts. And in all of these town halls and the thousands of people that I have seen and the thousands of people who've come through the photo line and told me what matters most to them, not a single one has said, Senator Warren, couldn't you please help banks with $200 billion in assets be regulated a little less? That's the problem here. So you know who's driving this. It's the banks who want less regulation. And that's what really gets me here. You want to do something for multi-billion-dollar banks. Hey, easy to get a bipartisan group to say, let's do it, and let's do it fast. You want to try to do something for the 147 million people whose data was stolen by Equifax? You can't get anything to move around this place. You want to try to help out veterans who've been cheated on home mortgages and student loans? It's hard to get something to move. But boy, jump in there to help the $250 billion banks, and all of a sudden, that has to move and has to move right away. That's not in the interest of the American people. It's in the interest of the banks who will make better profits if they have less regulation, and in the interest of the banks who are willing to put the entire economy at risk in order to boost their own profits. Not that I feel strongly about this. Thank you. Thank you.